Have you gone to a talk therapist like me and failed to get the results you were looking for? Welcome to episode 122 of the Be Yourself and Love It podcast. I'm here with a friend of mine, the great Gary Campbell. He's gone through his own journey of self-healing, much like many of us have, and he's now using those techniques that he found useful on himself to help with his mission of healing the world and bringing trauma-informed practice to more people. Gary, thank you so much for joining me on Be Yourself and Love It podcast.
Thank you for such a wonderful entry, Antony. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Well, let's just hope that the exit is as good as the entry. So
We're off.
We're off. I find that if you start on a funny note, then it's good to that it's easy to keep it humorous. But if you start awful serious, then it's hard to switch between funny and serious. We probably will get into some serious business, but I know you guys at home are tuning in for some form of intellectual entertainment, so we'll bring the full force of our personalities to that. Okay, I think a good place to start is, well, first of all, you practice a technique, a trauma therapy called Brainspotting. Is that fair? Would you add anything
Yes.
else to that?
Yeah, I would. That's correct. My primary modality is Brainspotting therapy, and then that naturally leads into other forms. But you're absolutely correct. Brainspotting is the central modality that I use both on myself and with clients.
Okay, but we're not going to give away any surprises too soon for anyone who doesn't know what Brainspotting is yet. I think a better place to start would be, how did you come to practicing these weird, maybe some would say cutting edge modalities? Like, let's hear a little bit about your own journey to try and heal yourself, and culminating in how you discovered Brainspotting.
Yeah, sure. So completely agreed. Brainspotting is cutting edge. It is new and it is intuitive. Some would even say it's strange or weird. So yes, I'd absolutely agree with that. In terms of myself, I didn't really have any indication whatsoever that I had trauma of any kind, apart from some talking therapy that I had when I was in my teens. And that was for generalized anxiety and perfectionistic tendencies around exams. And that was your classic sort of cognitive behavioral model. And unlike yourself, as you said in the intro, it wasn't particularly effective talk therapy for me, for my particular individual case. It didn't help very, very much. So after that, for me, I was one of those people that just said, I don't think therapy works on me. You know, in my ignorance, I didn't know anything else about any other modalities. So all through my 20s, I was just focused on being a musician, being a classical musician, and didn't think anything more about therapy. Just as I say, thought doesn't work for me. And by that, I mean, I would go to a session, we would speak through things logically, cognitively, and sometimes I would get slightly upset. Mostly anger would come up, and then I would go home with it, sit on that, and then come back with it again. So it didn't feel like anything was being processed or any internal change was happening. So I just ended up frustrated with the sessions and thought, this isn't working.
Right. Okay. I want to talk. Yeah, we've actually discussed a little bit about this ourselves, because I'm not a fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't know if you tried any other modalities. It doesn't really matter if you did or not. It sounds like you found something that was more efficient for you. I'm not really a fan of cognitive behavioral therapy, in the way I think you said it to me is, you can't logic yourself out of trauma. What I think, don't get me wrong, I think there could be a place for some form of cognitive behavioral therapy, but I think it would be techniques, but it would be to sort of take control of the mind to encourage yourself through engaging with the emotions. I think this idea that you can change your emotions by changing your thoughts, at best um the results can be temporary or and um let's see, superficial. Some people just really need to talk, and even if they whatever therapist they go to, as long as that therapist is empathetic and has a good bedside manner, they might benefit from that because they maybe haven't, let's say, from my perspective, attention is to humans like sunlight is to flowers. And a lot of people, especially in their childhood, completely deficient in this essential nutrient. And if they ever did get any attention, it was probably mostly negative attention. I'm brought in mind of the old expression, which is, once I did bad and that I heard ever. Twice I did good and that I heard never. You know? Um, like that line in the song where barely I've heard give me a home where the buffaloes roam, is a barely
Hmm.
I've heard a discouraging word. Just let me get out to the country where I can get away from all the discouraging words I hear about around here. And I think it speaks to a deep human need because I think I go on, but according to some of the foremost relationship experts, even people in a relationship who have a really, really good self esteem need a minimum of 4 positive interactions to negative interactions in order to sustain the goodwill in the relationship. And I think, like, say, in my household, it would have been lucky if my parents had fo- uh, for only 4 negative interactions for every positive interaction with each other, let alone with me. So yeah, I think like one of the things I do is give people a high quality attention supplement if they're deficient in that nutrient. But I think in general, this idea that we are emotional before we're verbal. You feel before you think. the the mass of your experience is sensational. Like, I don't mean that it's
Hmm.
utterly fantastic, but it comes in the form of more subtle um, impulses than thought. And in fact, I think the phenomenon of overthinking itself is expressed as actually a trauma response
Yep.
and um, an indicator that there's unresolved fight or flight responses and anxiety in the system. So it's interesting, this idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is if you write down your thoughts and then you challenge them, or like, is that really true? Actually, I kind of like, well, that could be useful just in itself because you get clarity in your thoughts. But the idea, and it kind of helps to externalize them, to write them down. But the idea, I kind of felt like cognitive behavioral therapy was teaching people to do what they do naturally even better. And what they do naturally, if you grow up in this society, is every time you feel something inconvenient, you think, well, I don't really like feeling angry or something else, or upset or guilty or ashamed. So what I'll do is I'll give myself reasons not to feel that. In other words, you repress yourself using your thoughts. Whereas what I'd really like to do in my practice is get into what it's like to see the world through the lens of that emotion. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to believe everything that you think when you're angry or guilty or ashamed, but it means that you don't, let's say, refract or turn your one self into two people who then have a fight in your head for control of the steering wheel, because I don't think that works. What I remember is Carl Rogers, one of my heroes, saying, the peculiar thing I find is when I accept myself as I am, I change. And the first thing was be to bring unconditional self-acceptance into the room, including for all your unpleasant thoughts and feelings. And then maybe, you know, something will happen. You'll come naturally. via working through your emotions to a more enlightened outlook without trying to force one upon yourself. So that's where I disagree with CBT. I'm sure you'll have plenty to come back on.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first thing that I remember is also adding to that, there's a Carl Jung quote, which is, I would much rather be a whole man than a good man.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, that kind of sums it up, of integration of the self, the true self, the authentic self, and knowing who that is, with all the good and the bad and the shadow, as Jung would put it, the shadow self, incorporating that is more important than going around in the world with this projected self of I am good through and through, and then repressing these parts of ourselves. So that's the first thing that I notice. And also that I completely agree with, there is a use case scenario for CBT, but the way it's sort of plastered across a bunch of case scenarios, as in this is the thing that can universally help all of you, that is problematic at best. And it certainly was for me, because as you've heard, what I understood from it was trauma therapy doesn't work for me, so therefore I can't be traumatized. And that was even more personally invalidating, ultimately, of whatever this overwhelming stuff I'm feeling, I must be wrong. Then yes. And then the last thing you were saying was, it doesn't help if someone's having these overwhelming things and then they are helped in being even more logical about their feelings, because that's exactly what I was doing anyway. So I didn't need to go to a specialist to help me logic my way out of my emotions, or try to. I didn't need that help. I was already professional at that. What I needed help with was understanding the sensations, the emotions I was feeling, and helping to process those. So that leads to how I ultimately ended up finding Brainspotting, which I would say, at least in my experience, it's the opposite of CBT, in that it goes completely from the bottom up. By that I mean from the body up to the brain, rather than the brain trying to influence the body, as you said, is also problematic to try to do it that way.
Awesome. So yeah, the term "nice guy" is pretty much synonymous with doormat these days, thank God. So so where we were up to, as you thought, so you didn't have a notion that you were traumatized. That's interesting for me, because coming out of my home, I definitely thought I was traumatized. I got early the notion, William Wordsworth, the child is the father of the man. That's like the 1800s. That notion's been riding around, and yet how unseriously society has taken it. I read books like How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, and Listen So Kids Will Talk, and Summerhill in my early 20s, and those were like very validating to me, to be like, oh wow, I really was mistreated as a child. It wasn't all in my head. But I mean, I don't know how much you want to disclose, but you've told me a little bit about your family background. And hearing about that, I would have come away with the assumption that I was traumatized. What conclusions did you come to coming away from childhood?
Yeah, I ultimately, what I saw around me. So just for context, clarification, I grew up in a very Scottish, very working class family, single parent household with 3 boys, of which I was the middle one, the weird middle one. And yeah, what I remember is this work ethic, this idea that was never particularly said out loud, but this idea of, you've got to work hard. Life is hard. Life is a struggle. That's what I felt and observed around me. So with that comes this idea that if you are to be a good child and get the attention, as you say, this vitamin that you need to be sucking it up, so to speak. You need to be accepting that life is hard work. And that's exactly what I did. I worked really hard at school to get the best grades that I could. I very much tried to be a people pleaser, and not to cause any trouble with my personal emotions if I was struggling with anything. So it's likely because of that I didn't really allow space myself, and also socially, contextually within school, there wasn't the space available for me to be open and vulnerable to those emotions. So those became a mystery to myself. And I'm not sure if in your clients you've noticed this, but certainly with me, the theme that I found with the majority of people I work with is compounding not only an alienation from society, from the people around you, but also an alienation of your true self, of your needs and your desires and what you need, and being alienated from that also. And those two things compounding to make a whole bunch of compensatory measures and symptoms and damage over the years, especially in a complex post-traumatic stress disorder type scenario. So I believe that's why I wouldn't have said, "Oh, I'm traumatized," because it wasn't acute trauma. It wasn't, trauma with a capital T. So that was, again, out of ignorance. That was my only understanding of, war veterans were traumatized, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
I just didn't know anything about it.
That's interesting. So yeah, I've had that question from clients before, which is, I just can't think of any event that, inspired this trait or this, response in me, whatever it is. I'm not being very accurate. I think people get the picture. And I would say, why do you think that it had to be one thing? It's a lot of the time it's the water we swim in, like you said, there was a general sense that was never articulated. Work hard or else. Life is hard. The rules are never etched in stone, because if they were etched in stone, someone could come along and say why, but you absorb them from the environment. And I think we've got this notion now, which is quite helpful, of complex PTSD, which it gets away from the war veteran, or the you were raped, or you were in a car accident, or you saw your mum die, or anyone die, or view of trauma as one incident, but complex PTSD being more something that's assimilated from the environment, by a general sense of the kind of things that go on in general. So that's great. Where you were up to was you decided, well, I'm going to be a musician, and you excelled in classical guitar for a long time. Would you like to continue with your biographical details?
Yeah, sure. So the guitar very much turned up when I was around 18 years old. Up until then, typical Scottish upbringing, I'd been doing bagpipes, and I'd shown musical potential with that, playing by ear, learning it relatively quickly, being able to move my fingers in complex patterns, that kind of thing. And studious, I would do the work, crucially. So because I was getting praise for doing that, and that was creating a lot of pride in the family, the idea of one of the sons being a bagpiper, that I started to realize, okay, again, that unsaid connection was made of, if I play music to a very high level, not just from my family, but also from my community, I get praise, I get respect. So it created this cycle of, I see, so playing music at a very high level is how you get attention, love, validation. Although still this was a mystery to me. I just thought, I really like music and I like playing it to people. So that's what I thought was going on. So then I discovered the guitar when I was 18, and same thing happened. Just became very obsessed with it, self-taught. And then I went to college to study guitar, did electric guitar, then acoustic guitar. And then by my 20s, I was studying classical guitar privately. And it just became my life, became my world. That's how I knew everyone. That's how I socialized. That's how I earned my money. That's what I did when I got home to relax. My practice went up to 4, 5, 6, 7. At one point, it was 8 hours a day. And I was fitting around everything round about that. I was quite an accomplished teacher, so I was teaching between schools and things. It just, after school clubs. I was performing, all of it, communities. I was in guitar club communities and things. My entire week, everything, my life was just playing the guitar. So as you can imagine, that literally became my identity. That became the self. That became my projected ego, or Jung would say the persona. My persona was, I am a guitar. This is the thing that I do. Here's the thing that gives me value in the world. And it was almost like, don't look around the guitar. Don't look at me. It's me and the guitar. And when I put this in front of people, I get praise, attention, love. So as you can imagine, that all came to a head. I ended up in a music conservatoire after a good few years of studying. And that's when things started to fall apart. I got some teachers that were, let's say, not ideal for me, were not pedagogically sound. They essentially abused my technique and my musicality and the things that I had built up that they previously praised. Once I was locked into the system and I had paid my money to be there, suddenly they changed their tune. And now I had to. Yes.
Now you had to.
So I had to.
Yeah, go on.
I had to change my technique completely. So all those, your 10,000 hours of studying a particular technique and way of playing, all that muscle memory, I was expected to completely reverse it and turn it on its head within the space of 8 months, whilst I studied other very intense things.
Why was this to your Was this supposed to be to your benefit? Could it
supposedly, yes. So that's why they were not pedagogically sound. They had no intention of. Yeah, carry on, man.
Tell me, they were deliberately trying to sabotage your career?
I don't think deliberately. It was more, I would say it was out of ignorance. They had a particular way of teaching, a particular technique that they were very dogmatically focused on. And I auditioned with them, played really well, and they complimented my musicality. Said, absolutely, we're happy to have you on board. For people that haven't been to a conservatoire, you have to audition. So they need to see you up close, see you sight reading, see you performing to them, even see you sight reading in front of them. So they'd had their chance to see everything about my technique and musicality and decide ultimately yes or no if they wanted to take me on. And what was really particularly interesting was in the audition process, when I was asked if I had any questions, I said, is there any particular technique or thing I need to work on in my playing so we can hit the ground running after summer when I come here? No. Oh, you missed a rest there. Maybe work on your counting, work on your rhythm stuff. So I did, and when I appeared then, and I was locked into the system, it was a rude awakening for me. So that's when I started to get issues ultimately.
Well, don't leave us waiting with bated breath. What happens?
Yeah. So as we've been saying, you can't logic your way out of trauma, and a big part of what I do, as you know, Antony, is very intuitive, and it's based on communication from the body first and then the mind following. So what was happening was, in that time, I was obsessively trying to get my mind to put instructions into my body that ultimately didn't want to be there, that had no right being there. And eventually, after doing that for 8 hours a day, sometimes 9 or 10, under emotional, financial stress, and ultimately like bullying, like a very harsh environment, a humiliatory environment with the pressure of exams as well, my nervous system got to the point that something had to break. It couldn't keep going at that level of pressure. And eventually something did snap, but it wasn't my mind, it was my body. So the hand that I fretted with started spasming when I was playing, when I was practicing. And it happened the first few times, and I thought, oh, I'm just tired. I'll rest it, do some mental practice. And then it kept coming back. And I thought, okay, showed it to my teachers. Again, they just went, oh, that's weird. Or I struggled to show it because it was random. It would just appear at certain times and then go away again. So it was very difficult to demonstrate to them. But I was getting increasingly worried. And then as it got closer and closer to my exams, the fingers started twitching and then they would curl into my hand. Then I started becoming worried. And then I was asking around the school, asking if anyone had come across this. No, they were just asking me, are you in pain or anything? And I was going, no, there's no pain. I'm just not in control of it. What I said to people, even the Health for Musicians hub within the conservatoire, when I went and said to them, I said, it's like I'm losing control of my hand. It's like my hand is rebelling against me. I'm asking it to do things and it's just saying no. It's like a child refusing. It's having a tantrum. And it kept going, kept going. I finished that first year, thought I'll take the summer off. And that break, that will do me good. That's what I thought. Once I came back after the summer, it had gotten worse and worse and worse to the point I'd have to cancel gigs. My hand now, even if I took my hand up to mentally rehearse practicing, all my fingers would curl into my palm and just leave my index finger. And then it would stay there for half an hour, sometimes 45 minutes. It would be stuck like that.
Oh my
so,
word. Did you not go to a physiotherapist at this point, or had you previous?
At that point,
obviously.
At that point, again, it's a trauma response of when stuff like this starts happening, we try to fix everything ourselves because that's what we learn to do as children of this is up to me. I've got to fix this. So I tried, it didn't work. So I went to a specialist musician GP. And as soon as she saw my hand, she played piano as well as being a general GP. So she knew about hand conditions. And she took one look at my hand and just said, I'm sorry, son, you've got musician's focal dystonia. And that's the first time I heard that word. And from that day onward, my life changed a lot. So, yeah.
Wow, it's shocking. Do you know what? Yeah, it's really interesting. Sorry, I don't mean that like you're a test subject under a
no, sure, go ahead.
glass. Interesting in that way. I've seen this happen a couple of times. I had a friend who I think he always wanted to form a band, and I don't know, to me at that time, being in your early 30s sounded really old. I think I was in my early 20s, and we finally got together in a band, and I was playing bass. And shortly after, he got a condition and couldn't play much anymore. I knew another guy who was a really, really good lead guitarist and got ME. Myself, I've not really talked about this much on the show. In the beginning of, the whole lockdown thing. Prior to that, for a few years on and off, I'd been running a workshop called How to Make Small Talk. And it was just, I created exercises and games, but because you can't really practice things in real life situation. It's like trying to practice one specific thing while you're driving, it's too live a situation. So what I did was I tried to isolate certain situations and I needed to adjust the game. Sometimes they didn't come out right the first time, but then after 3 or 4 tweaks, we had a really good game that was really helpful to people. So when lockdown started, I started doing this online one-to-one, and yeah, it was very, very popular. I got lots and lots of clients, and my voice just gave out. It was so scary and so depressing. I've never been so like on purpose in my life as in that period. I was just like, the kind of person who would get to a certain level of income and be like, oh yeah, I'm comfortable, and then I'd stop hustling, and then maybe at some point I wouldn't I'd feel like, oh, stuff's drying up and I'm not making enough money, and at some point I'd panic and I'd make lots of clients happen, and then I was in this repeating cycle. This was the first time that was like, don't stop, man, just book more people in, it's lockdown, you're going to need the money later, so You've not
Hmm.
got much better to do, and I was soaring and I was learning so much. I was mapping it all out. I thought maybe there's about a dozen problems that people have, and if I continue doing this, I'll be able to figure out what each of the problems are, since some of them are common to different people, and engineer a solution for each of them. Um, and yeah, I kind of went on tour of America, and
Amazing.
I basically had to stop doing the small talk coaching, the social for people with social anxiety. I just went back to counseling because I didn't need to talk very much. Sometimes I was making a
Mm.
decision between seeing my friend. I was like, if I go out and see my friends and I do a lot of talking tonight, will I be able to work tomorrow? I better not. It was so horrible. And
Hmm.
yeah, I never really, I mean, my voice is performing pretty well, and and I have taken a couple of people on for small talk coaching. But when I went to the States, I was just busy with other stuff, so I could kind of forget about it. But I never like full. I mean, I've gone anyway. I I feel like that's enough for just now about me. But it's interesting how this happens. For me, it was almost like there was something in my unconscious that said, um, "Sorry, you're not allowed to be successful. I refuse to let you." Um, and yeah, it's like sometimes I still feel like my voice is under strain and I can't sing for long periods of time anymore. I'll really feel it, but I mean, I manage pretty much. I mean, I do the show, so I must manage. Um, But yeah, it's really interesting how that can happen, and to people when they kind of reach a certain zenith. Um, and what is it? Something some is it seems like almost cruel to me, and I'm sure you experience much the same.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that. So thanks for sharing that. It's very, yeah, as you say, it's interesting that that's how it happens.
Right.
And really, in reflection of it, it's almost, if it happened on a TV show, it would be like darkly
Yeah.
funny or something that,
Or yeah,
it's like the very thing that you love to do that gives you
yeah.
passion and purpose is now going to
Uh-huh.
become your main source of stress and dismay
Mhm.
in your life. It's as if some god or devil character has
It
come in and
is.
flipped the script on your life and is just
Yeah.
observing you now, like maniacal laugh
Yeah.
kind of thing.
People say, well, yeah, on that point, people would say it's almost unrealistic. Oh, it's too convenient that his voice went
Mm.
before the theater performance, or his hand went before the guitar um, concert or whatever. But
Mhm.
as I said, I just mentioned, I've observed this happen to at least a few people. So it's, if anything, it's all too realistic.
Mhm. It is. Yeah, exactly. So it's to me, I conceptualize it as rebellion of the body.
Hmm.
Is the
Hmm.
body just went enough? No, I will not be your vehicle anymore in this way. And I
Hmm.
think years and years of neglect, of disrespect, of ultimately being head led. I want to do this conceptually, and body, you will bring me there.
Hmm. Hmm.
And at the same time, I'm not going to fuel you correctly. I'm not going to give you enough sleep. I'm not going to give you enough rest and respect. I'm going to expect you just to take it like a car that's just been run
Hmm.
into the ground.
Hmm.
And eventually, it just broke and went nope, not no more. So the process since then, that's what ultimately led me into brain spotting. And that's what helped me understand that I was traumatized at a deep body based nervous system level, and I understood why CBT had not worked for me in the past, that ultimately I was living here
Hmm.
and neglecting everything from
Hmm.
the neck down. And this ultimately was just a small symptom of years of neglect and abuse of the body. And now it had finally found a way to communicate this to me. It's,
Right.
the wheels literally fell off the car. So now I
Right.
had to take a look at it and start going, right, what have I messed
Yeah.
up here? And it
Yeah,
turned out
these can
a
really
lot.
go on. Yeah, these can really push you. Like, I've spoken about like various ailments and things like that that I've dealt with naturopathy, but I had to try so many wrong things to find the right thing. And it sounds like this kind of pushed you in certain directions that you might not have moved otherwise,
Yeah.
and otherwise, in order to discover something that really worked for you. So what was that journey like?
Yeah. So I looked into everything. I was researching everything from neurology to nutrition and everything in between. I was learning about everything from, the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, how that affects your mental health, your biology. I was researching the gut microbiome. I was researching focal dystonia itself and finding out what cohorts, what groups of people tend to get this more often than others. I was looking at, is it genetic factors? Is it epidemiological thing? I was just endless research. And ultimately, it comes down to, when you're suffering, nothing is silly. Nothing is woo-woo. Nothing is alternative. If you're in pain and nothing you're trying is working or giving you relief, and in fact, your condition is getting worse, you get to the point where you'll say, throw me anything. And if it works, I'll try it and I'll keep doing it. And for me, of all the things that I tried, the thing that I think of it as a fizzed up bottle, if you're traumatized and repressed, the thing that popped the cap was my first Brainspotting session. And again, that was just research and trying to fix this finger issue. I'd heard that people had been getting relief from this very new type of therapy. And at that point, I was trying everything anyway. So I just went, yeah, sign me up. I was in that state of, give me everything. I'll try everything. I'll try anything. And I was very fortunate. Right from the first session, things just exploded for me. So it was really, really powerful and incredibly weird and incredibly intuitive, as you've seen and experienced as well. It was like nothing I'd felt before in my life. It was, just sitting with a practitioner and in the room, and a stranger up until that point, being able to open up areas of memories, of trapped sensations, of past trauma, and linking it all together whilst I wasn't even thinking conceptually, or I wasn't really speaking to them. I was in awe. It's few times in your life that you can really say that genuinely, but it was the idea of a stranger to me, someone who didn't even know me before the session, being able to open these areas that I didn't even know existed in myself. I couldn't believe what was happening, and it just kept happening. Every session there was new things, as if there was just this treasure trove of stuff that was there, and I just hadn't had access to it. But once it was opened, it just kept coming and coming, and it was overwhelming for a lot of sessions, but beautiful as well.
Okay, let's ask a question that might have an interesting answer. They all have so far, but what is trauma?
So I could give you quotes. My favorite quote on it actually is from Peter Levine. So he says that trauma is what happens to us in the event of not having a compassionate witness during a time of challenge. And that includes ourselves not being able to be a compassionate witness. I think that's very true. But I would add to that, at least for me and my understanding of myself and my clients, trauma is when sensations and emotions are trapped in the body, and when they come up, the mind and the body are not able to come into alignment of it. And it can work both ways. The mind can be remembering things and the body is not willing to open up that sensory capsule. And the other way around, the body is giving us information either in the form of something like anger or a very strong sensation, and the mind is suppressing it and saying, no, 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 we don't want that story to come up. We don't want that. So it's like a system error. And ultimately healing comes from the realignment of those two, connecting the body back to the mind. And that comes back to the Jung quote I was saying, it's better than to be a good man is to be a whole man, is to be connected to these challenging things that made you who you are, as much as the positive, the things you associate yourself with that are good, that are that's ultimately, to me, what it is. It's that disconnection to the self.
Nice. One way I found quite helpful was the traumatologist Robert Scare said, I paraphrase, when we suffer a trauma, the mind reacts, but it doesn't then unreact. And so we continue, we have this term we use almost colloquially, sometimes in kind of libertarian circles, we make fun of it. Triggered. I'm triggered. I think it's a really good word, because what it means is in the moment of being triggered, the past is active in you, and you cannot, or maybe it would be more accurate to say the unresolved past is active in you. And that's why something reminds you of something that happened in the past that you reacted to, but you didn't unreact, and then all of a sudden that reaction is trying to complete itself in the present. And if you don't know that, you don't know what to do with it. You might look like quite a weirdo to everyone else around you. So, part of what we're trying to do is bring people into contact with material that is incomplete, so that they can complete it and therefore be free of the past and more alive to the present as a consequence of that.
Yeah, exactly right. When you're connected to yourself, you are constantly in the present moment. You'll probably have witnessed this from clients as well. If you're highly anxious, you're possibly future pacing things. You're constantly thinking about what might happen. If you're more on the depressive spectrum, you might be ruminating about things that happened in the past and making a story about those things. And that's making you feel the way you feel in the present. But once you are really connected with yourself, the good and the bad, and you understand what everything is and you're allowing it up, you can't help but be in the present moment. And that also, I think, is a good sign that someone is traumatized. The idea of being present with their body right in the present moment very often is threatening in some way to them, or makes them incredibly vulnerable. Whereas ultimately, it should eventually be at a stage where it's like, oh yeah, that's great, not having to think about the past or the future and just being here now with the people I'm with. You'd think that would be a blissful state. But for traumatized people, it is not. It's a state of danger, ultimately, for a lot of people.
Okay, so you discovered Brainspotting, you tried a few sessions, and everyone was mind-blowing. And then how did you make sense of what you were experiencing?
Yeah, through a lot of journaling and self-reflection, I started just recording videos like on this setup, almost like in space films and things like that, where it's the last entry before whatever stuff blows up or whatever. It would be like that, where I'm just recording something and I've figured something out in my head and I'm not cohesive yet enough to write it down, and I'm just rambling saying I've experienced this and this thing has come up and it's connected to this that happened in the past. And it's just these almost like chicken scrawl hieroglyphics of all these things coming together.
How did you gain your understanding of trauma?
Experientially. So I would experience it first and then look back on it and then read up about it, look through my notes and see the patterns ultimately.
How did you gain the conceptual framework to contextualize your first-hand experience? Because you've obviously mentioned Peter Levine, and how did you know where to look and what to read? And
Yeah, so generally, by then understood that brain spotting was in an umbrella term. It was generally seen as a group of therapies known typically as somatic
Mm-hmm.
therapies, just
Yeah,
ultimately meaning body-based therapies.
right.
And by then, also through the brain spotting, I'd had tremors come up. So
Yeah,
then I discovered TRE again experientially first, and then someone told me about it. So
right.
then I discovered that, and then also IFS, so internal family
Right.
systems, had
So
all come
yeah,
out.
so I've had quite a few interviews on IFS, internal family systems, early on in the show. I know a lot of my new listeners um, weren't around at the beginning of the show, but with a guy called Pete Gerlach, now sadly deceased, a great mind, and those shows were pretty popular at the time. But for that, so people can look into that. That's when we look at the psyche not as a unit of whole, but as a number of parts that each have their own duties. So if you've ever had that struggle between procrastinating, wanting to do something and also not wanting to do it, that could be understood as, you've got one protector part who's like, you better do this thing, or nothing's going to happen for you in your life, and another part that is like, oh, but dad, I really don't want to. And that's trying to protect you from the unpleasant emotions associated with the task. Often it's a lot more complicated than that, and there's several parts. But I think involved, that's probably outside the remit of this particular show.
Mm-hmm.
TRE, though, briefly, I've mentioned that on the show before, trauma release exercises. Would you just give a quick explanation of what that is for those at
Mm-hmm.
home who don't know? So maybe something
Yep.
that could be explored more in the future.
Yeah, so it's a completely natural mammalian response. So we as humans have it naturally built into us, which is when we encounter trauma, we have this system built into us in which we can literally shake it off of ourselves
Much
through
as
tremors.
Taylor Swift has encouraged us.
The modern thinker of our time, Taylor Swift, she is,
Yeah.
yeah, she's told us about this. She is forewarned. Yes, exactly. So these tremors you can see for example, in the Serengeti in Africa, if an animal has had a close brush with death where they've literally escaped the jaws of a predator, you'll see them lay down in the grass and they tremor. They
Right.
have this
That's right.
tremor that comes over their whole body. And that is them letting go of that trauma that just
Right.
occurred to them.
So they're discharging the fight or flight response from their body. And a lot of the time when someone has a panic attack or something like that, they start to shake. And because we're not trauma informed, people will put their hands on their leg and say, that's okay, you don't have to shake, and bring them a cup of tea or something like that. And they'll never discharge the trauma. I think it was also Robert Scare, but it might have been a different traumatologist who said the only animals who don't do this are pets, zoo animals, lab animals, and humans. And what they have in common, said the traumatologist, is they all live in a cage. Our cage is social. So we don't actually understand that it's natural to discharge the fight or flight response from our body by shaking. So you started to tremor during some of your brain spotting sessions. Did you just have one brain spotting therapist, or did you see more than one practitioner?
At the time this was all coming up, I just had one. But then after that, once I had all these modalities started coming up, then I went and saw many. But
Okay.
yes, that's what it
And what
was.
year
So
was
yeah,
this in? What year was it in that you
this
started?
was 2022, around that
Okay,
kind of
wow.
time.
Yeah, quite recent. So
Yeah.
you were seeing a bunch. So you saw different practitioners, and you saw how they worked and what you liked
Hmm.
from some, and what their shortcomings were. And
Exactly.
you learned about TRE from one of them, or from
Hmm.
from
Yeah.
another source.
Yeah. So
Right.
yeah, actually, in whilst I was training to do brain spotting, I volunteered to be part of the practicum. So the person that was leading the training brain spotted me, and of course, I started
Hmm.
moving a lot as I tended to do.
Hmm.
Um, and then I had someone in the group was actually a trained TRE provider. And she reached out to
Oh
me
wow,
and started
amazing.
saying, "Oh, it's beautiful to see your connection with your body. You clearly have done lots
Wow,
of TRE
wow.
sessions." And I was Googling it
Yeah.
there and then going, what does this
Uh-huh.
mean?
Right.
So it
Perfect.
was,
It's
yeah,
good that
all
your teacher
natural.
that the teachers came. Yeah, and obviously when I did a um brain spotting session with you, I started to tremor as well, and I was able to
You did.
recognize that as TRE because I'd experienced TRE before, but you hadn't at this point, and you're lucky your teacher came. She knew about
Yes.
it and was able to point you in certain directions.
It was so
Mhm.
fortunate, yeah. But at that point, I'd surrendered by that point. As I say, when you're suffering, you'll let whatever come. So I knew stuff was
Yeah.
happening, and I was just handing over the reins and just going, just let my body let this out. Ultimately,
Mhm. Mhm.
so
Mhm.
yeah, that's how, and that's now how I work with clients, is very intuitively, very holistically in that way, and ultimately experientially. So I suppose I should
Mhm.
at this point explain then what exactly
What is
what
brain
is
spotting? The
brain spotting.
culmination of
Yeah,
our show.
yeah. So
Right.
what we'll do is I'll explain it for a bit from my experience of it, and then if you're comfortable, Anthony, you can say something about what you experienced with it as well,
Mm.
because that's the thing with brain spotting. It's entirely experiential, and then you
Mhm.
understand it after experiencing it. So how I understand it is that whenever you are speaking about an event or even just recalling it in your mind, as I'm doing now, your eyes naturally go to certain locations in your head. And depending on the type of memory that it is, whether it's a neutral or a positive memory, or perhaps a traumatic memory, your eyes go to particular positions. So as I'm thinking about different things, you can see my eyes are wandering around the room, and this isn't conscious. It's just happening as I change from memory to memory. So in a brain spotting therapy session, the therapist is trained to spot these things as your eyes may wander to a particular area. So if it's a particularly negative memory, a traumatic memory, you may see something like this, where they mention a particular word and their eyes go like that just for a second.
Yeah.
And your
You
job
might
is
want to
to
explain for people who are just listening, because a lot of people just do the audio.
Mhm. Yeah, of course. So I was showing there just, and you can try this yourself. If you look in front of a mirror, you put your phone up in front of you and you record yourself as you're speaking about things, you'll see this happen. Also, children, when you ask them a question, you'll see their eyes wander all around the room. And it's just you're accessing your sensory information to
Mm.
remember that thing. It's not just cognitive. You're accessing your senses to remember that memory. So if a traumatic memory, we were saying earlier, is not a fully connected memory, it's where we've not been allowed, the body hasn't been allowed to fully express that, it will be incomplete. So when the eyes go there, if you hold them there instead of letting them come away again, the body then starts experiencing this capsule ultimately of sensations, of emotions that are attached to that memory. And what's remarkable about this is sometimes you don't even need to have said anything to the therapist. You can just be in it in your mind and you're going through it, and your eyes will go somewhere and the therapist can begin working with you from there. So this is super powerful if someone is mute or they are just unable to even
Mhm.
speak about what's happened to them, or they just don't want to disclose it ultimately. And then they can then be guided with the therapist, dual attuning to them. So the therapist having a deep connection with that person so that they feel safe and heard, so that the body can now start letting up all of these incomplete sensations attached with that memory. And the goal of brain spotting is to take that memory and get it to the point where they look at that spot where that memory is kept. And now when they look at it, they feel neutral or even positive. They now look at it and laugh, or they feel a great sense of warmth or pride
Mm.
when they look at it. And we do this mainly through pendulation. So we find somewhere that is positive or a neutral memory for them, and then we take them into the activation, maybe the memory that's not so positive. And then we pendulate between them so that the positive, happy energy in one brain spot starts to influence the activation in another. So as that activation spot is gradually opening up, we then get the energy also from the positive brain spot. influencing it. And the whole point is that system regulation is gradually you get to the point where you look around and it's like these emotional landmines in your visual field have all been let off in a controlled manner. And now you look at them and you're neutral or you're positive. That's the whole point. That's what we're looking to do.
And what does someone experience as a consequence of neutralizing these landmines in day-to-day life?
Less reactivity. So ultimately you respond to situations rather than having a visceral reaction to them. And you're aware of it. So it's from the body up. So that's the thing that's difficult to control. If anyone's, traumatized out there and they've had something trigger them, very often it's the body throws up this reaction to it and the mind is trying to gain control of what's coming up. And ultimately by then it's too late to control what's going on. But with brain spotting, it's working from the body up. So it's now the brain is ultimately the last to know. It's the last link in the chain to make that cognitive connection and go, that used to really trigger us and bother us. And now I just don't care about it in a positive way, not in a, I don't care negative. It's just like, that's just neutral. I don't mind.
Yeah, it doesn't take up any of my processing time anymore.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd like to experience it more before I feel like I can make a lot of major comments, but what I can say is I definitely experienced something. Material presented itself, and it wasn't. I don't think it was too conceptual. It was intense feelings, and I got the tremors pretty quick as well. And I did feel like I was discharging it, but it was exactly that. It was like, harkening back to what I said earlier. Exactly. Here's a bunch of incomplete things that at some point you reacted to, but then didn't complete the reaction to. Your brain didn't unreact. I don't know exactly what it was, but I had to work through it, and having worked through it, felt the better for it. So interesting. How did brain spotting come about?
It came about with a guy called David Grand. This was in the early 2000s. He was an EMDR therapist. So you may have heard of that, the eye movement desensitization. So that is someone that waves a pointer in front of your eyes as you are recalling something for people that don't know. And it's aiming to connect the two hemispheres of the brain to create this cohesion about that memory. So it tries to achieve it that way. David, just by chance, happened to intuitively stop waving the pointer in front of the person and just held it in one spot where their eyes started blinking rapidly and moving backwards and forwards. And he just, through instinct, he left the pointer there. And this was a pro-level ice skater in the United States that was having problems doing a triple loop, which is a very complex and dangerous maneuver to do. And she hadn't been able to do it, kept falling and hurting herself. And it was related to trauma, ultimately. When she arrived on this point with David's help in the session, she relived all of that and ultimately popped that capsule in her head. And then from that session onwards, she was then able to do this triple loop maneuver without any problems at all. So then he kept experimenting with it, of course, just curious. He was open to it. And he then started sharing it with other EMDR therapists who then started using it also. And then from there, it became gradually distinguished from EMDR as brain spotting therapy, which is holding a point in a particular area of the visual field. So that's ultimately where it came from.
Excellent. Is there anything you want to explore or educate our audience about before we begin to wrap out the show?
Yeah, I would say that ultimately trauma and the healing from it, in my personal experience, is about connection. It's about when you were a child, for whatever reason, you didn't get the quality of connections that you needed. And as a result, you now struggle perhaps with connections with others, either in work or your relationships. And also, more importantly, your connection with yourself likely was damaged in some way. And the thing that I see in common with all therapists is that we are all trying to help, trying to be there, to be that connection, to help facilitate that connection with your authentic self. So I would say to anyone that is similar to me when I was younger, going, oh, I've tried this modality, that modality, it didn't work for me. I'm not traumatized because therapy didn't work for me. Just because the connection hasn't yet been made, it doesn't mean that you don't need the connection. So I would say be open, be curious, keep trying different modalities. If you feel something isn't right, ultimately it's about the connection to yourself. But in healing your connection with yourself, you change your connection with others. So one of my favorite bands is Gojira, the French heavy metal band. And one of their songs, the chorus in it says, when you change yourself, you change the world. And it's completely true. When you change your connection with yourself, you literally connect with others in a completely different way than you could before. So I would say if you're wondering and going, well, why should I do this? It seems painful. It seems horrible. Ultimately, it's about connection. First with yourself and then with others in your world.
Right. And that mirrors my own experience. It's called the Be Yourself and Love It podcast for a reason. It's not enough to be yourself, because maybe yourself, you think, oh, you mean the guy that didn't get dates at school? No, thank you. Be yourself and love it. You have to have a certain connection to yourself that is has a little bit of power to it, has a little bit of character, is assertive, is loving being yourself. So I hope that we can continue to help people and maybe more and more efficiently connect to themselves, so that they can see that the quality of your connection to others is contingent on the quality of your connection to yourself, and both can be extremely improved. If people want to try Brainspotting, how do they get in touch with you, Gary?
Yeah, so they just get in touch with me through the email that we have listed at the bottom. So that's gary.d.campbell26@gmail.com. And that's the main way to get in touch with me. And then from there, I consult with people and speak with people and then see if Brainspotting's the right fit for them. And then we can continue working together from there.
And like, excuse me, like myself, Gary works online. So if that's something that you'd like to experience, get in touch with Gary, gary.d.campbell at 26@gmail.com. Until next time, be yourself, but don't just be yourself and love it. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast, Gary.
Thank you, Antony, for having me. It's been great.